The autumn leaves crunched under Sarah Mitchell's boots as she made her way across the courtyard of Riverside Military Academy. 3 weeks into her first semester, she still felt like an outsider among the sea of cadets whose families had military legacies dating back generations. Her father, Mike Mitchell, had served his country with distinction, but he never talked about his service. He was a quiet man who worked as a security consultant and drove a 10-year-old Honda that looked painfully out of place among the BMWs and Mercedes in the academy parking lot. Sarah had earned her spot at Riverside through sheer determination and academic excellence. While other students hired expensive tutors and attended prep schools, she had studied by lamplight at their small apartment, working part-time jobs to help with expenses. Her father had always told her that respect was earned through actions, not inherited through bloodlines. She was about to discover just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The trouble started during her 3rd week in Colonel Harrison's military strategy class. Sarah had quietly excelled in every subject, but she made the mistake of correcting a tactical analysis that Bryce Thornton had presented to the class. Bryce came from a long line of military officers, and his grandfather had been a decorated general. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone he viewed as beneath his social status. "Miss Mitchell," Bryce said after class, his voice dripping with condescension, "perhaps you should remember your place here. This isn't a community college where anyone can pretend to understand military strategy." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. Her father had taught her that true strength came from self-control. "I wasn't pretending, Bryce. I was pointing out a flaw in your tactical assessment. If we were in a real combat situation, that mistake could cost lives." Bryce's face flushed red. "Combat situation? What do you know about combat? Your father probably spent his entire service pushing papers in some supply depot." Several other cadets had gathered around, sensing confrontation. Among them were Jake Morrison, whose father was a Navy admiral, and Trevor Walsh, son of an Air Force colonel. They formed an elite clique within the academy, united by their shared belief that military excellence was a birthright rather than something that could be earned. "Actually," Sarah said calmly, "my father served in the Navy for 15 years. He did his job well enough to earn an honorable discharge and several commendations." "Oh, please," Trevor laughed. "Commendations for what? Perfect attendance? I bet he never saw anything more dangerous than a paper cut." The cruel laughter that followed cut deep, but Sarah refused to let it show. She had learned from her father that sometimes the best response was silence. What she didn't tell them was that those commendations included 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. What she couldn't tell them was that Mike Mitchell had been part of SEAL Team 6, one of the most elite special operations units in the world. Her father had sworn her to secrecy about his service record. "The work I did," he had told her, "is not something to brag about. Good people do difficult things so others can sleep safely. Recognition isn't why we do it." As the weeks passed, the harassment escalated. Bryce and his friends seemed determined to make Sarah's life miserable. They would accidentally bump into her in hallways, causing her to drop her books. During formation drills, they would jostle her position, making it look like she couldn't keep proper alignment. In a mess hall, they would make loud comments about charity cases and diversity admissions whenever she walked by. The breaking point came during a weekend field exercise. The cadets were divided into squads for a tactical simulation in the woods surrounding the academy. Sarah found herself assigned to a squad led by Bryce, a decision that seemed deliberately designed to create conflict. The exercise was supposed to be a simple reconnaissance mission. Each squad had to navigate through dense forest terrain, locate a series of checkpoints, and return to base camp without being detected by the opposing team. Sarah knew the terrain well from her childhood camping trips with her father, and she quietly suggested an alternative route that would avoid the most obvious paths. When not taking navigation advice from someone whose daddy probably got lost trying to find the base commissary, Bryce sneered. "We'll stick to the standard approach." 2 hours later, their squad was hopelessly lost. The standard route had led them directly into a marsh that wasn't marked on their outdated maps. As they struggled through knee-deep mud and tangled vegetation, Sarah could see the frustration building in Bryce's face. When they missed the first checkpoint entirely and stumbled directly into the opposing team's ambush zone, His humiliation was complete. "This is your fault," he hissed at Sarah as they trudged back to base camp. "Their simulation a complete failure. If you hadn't distracted us with your stupid suggestions, we would have stayed focused." Sarah bit back her response. She had learned that there was no point in arguing with people who were determined to blame others for their own failures. But she could see that her restraint was being interpreted as weakness by Bryce and his followers. That evening, as Sarah sat alone in her dormitory room reviewing the day's events, she called her father. She didn't tell him about the harassment, but he seemed to sense something in her voice. "How are you holding up, kiddo?" Mike asked, his voice warm with concern. "It's challenging," Sarah admitted. "Some of the other cadets don't think I belong here." There was a long pause before her father responded. "You know, Sarah, I met a lot of people who confuse privilege with competence. They think that coming from the right family or having the right connections makes them superior. But in the real world, when lives are on the line, none of that matters. What matters is whether you can perform under pressure and whether you can be trusted to do the right thing when no one is watching." "How do you know if you're strong enough?" Sarah asked. "Strength isn't about never feeling afraid or never facing opposition," Mike said. "Real strength is continuing to do what's right even when it's difficult. It's about maintaining your principles when others try to make you compromise them. You're stronger than you know, Sarah. Trust yourself." After hanging up, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. She had worked too hard to get to Riverside to let a group of entitled cadets drive her away. Whatever they threw at her next, she would face it with the same quiet courage her father had shown throughout his military career. Little did she know that the real test was still to come. Bryce and his friends were about to escalate their campaign of harassment to a level that would force Sarah to reveal skills she had hoped to keep hidden. And when they finally pushed her too far, they would discover that underestimating the daughter of a Navy SEAL was a mistake they would never forget. The next morning brought news of an upcoming major field exercise that would test every cadet's tactical knowledge, physical endurance, and leadership abilities. It was an opportunity for Sarah to prove herself on an equal playing field. But it was also an opportunity for her tormentors to take their harassment to a dangerous new level. As Sarah prepared for what would become the defining moment of her time at Riverside Military Academy, she carried with her the lessons her father had taught her through years of patient guidance. She had no idea that those lessons, learned from one of America's most elite warriors, were about to serve her in ways she had never imagined. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. In a dense forest surrounding the academy, surrounded by cadets who saw her as an easy target, Sarah Mitchell was about to discover just how much her father's training had prepared her for this moment. And Bryce Thornton and his friend were about to learn why you should never underestimate someone based on appearances. The real story was just beginning. The announcement came during Monday morning formation. Colonel Harrison stood before the assembled cadets, his weathered face serious as he outlined the details of the upcoming survival and evasion exercise. This wasn't just another weekend drill. It was a 5-day intensive training scenario that would push every cadet to their physical and mental limits. You'll be dropped in teams of 8 at various points throughout the Allegheny National Forest, the colonel explained. Your mission is to navigate 40 miles of wilderness terrain while avoiding capture by our tracking teams. You'll have minimal equipment, limited food supplies, and you'll need to demonstrate every skill you've learned about survival, tactics, and teamwork. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was exactly the kind of challenge she had trained for her entire life, though her classmates didn't know it. Every weekend camping trip with her father had been a masterclass in wilderness survival. While other kids played video games, Sarah had learned to read weather patterns, identify edible plants, construct emergency shelters, and move through forest terrain without leaving a trace. Mike Mitchell had taught his daughter these skills not as military training, but as life lessons. The wilderness doesn't care about your excuses, he had told her during one memorable trip when she was 12 years old and struggling to start a fire in the rain. It only cares about your preparation and your determination to survive. As the colonel continued his briefing, Sarah noticed Bryce Thornton whispering to his usual group of followers. They kept glancing in her direction, and the expressions on their faces suggested they were planning something beyond simple harassment. Teams will be assigned randomly, Colonel Harrison announced, reaching for a list. However, squad leaders will be chosen based on your performance in previous exercises. Sarah's heart sank as she heard her name called as a member of Team 7, with Bryce Thornton designated as squad leader. The selection wasn't random at all. Someone had deliberately placed her under Bryce's command, and she had a sinking feeling that the next 5 days were going to test more than just her survival skills. The team assembled that afternoon for equipment inspection and final briefings. Besides Sarah and Bryce, the squad included Jake Morrison, Trevor Walsh, and for other cadets who had aligned themselves with the Academy's informal hierarchy. Sarah found herself completely isolated within her own team, surrounded by people who seemed more interested in making her fail than in completing the mission successfully. "Listen carefully," Bryce said as they reviewed their assigned route on a topographical map. "This exercise is about following orders and maintaining unit cohesion. We can't afford to have anyone going off on their own or trying to play hero." His eyes fixed on Sarah as he spoke, making his meaning clear. She was to keep quiet, follow orders, and not embarrass him with any displays of competence that might undermine his authority. The first day went smoothly enough. Their insertion point was a rocky clearing 15 miles north of the Academy, deep in old-growth forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. The tracking teams wouldn't begin hunting them until the second day, giving each squad time to establish their basic camp and plan their route to the extraction point. Bryce had chosen to set up their temporary base in a low valley near a stream, reasoning that access to water was their highest priority. Sarah could see immediately that it was a poor choice. The valley would be cold and damp at night, and their position left them visible from the ridgelines above. But when she quietly suggested an alternative location, Bryce cut her off. "We're not asking for your input, Mitchell. Your job is to follow orders, not question decisions made by people who actually know what they're doing." As evening approached, Sarah watched her teammates struggle with basic survival tasks that should have been second nature to military cadets. Trevor couldn't get his shelter properly secured and was likely to spend the night shivering in a collapsed tarp. Jake had managed to contaminate their water purification tablets, leaving them with a limited supply of safe drinking water. 2 other team members had foolishly consumed most of their rations during the first day, apparently not understanding that they needed to make their food last for the entire 5-day exercise. Sarah could have solved any of these problems in minutes, but Bryce's hostility made it clear that her help wasn't wanted. So she quietly set up her own efficient shelter, carefully rationed her supplies, and prepared for what she suspected would be a very long few days. The second day brought the first real test. The tracking teams had been released at dawn, and each squad needed to move quickly to avoid capture. Bryce led them along a well-traveled trail that offered easy walking but little concealment. Sarah bit her tongue as they moved through areas that left obvious tracks and passed several natural vantage points without taking basic precautions to avoid observation. By midday, they had covered less than 8 miles and were already showing signs of poor planning. Trevor was limping from blisters caused by improperly fitted boots. Jake was complaining loudly about hunger after eating the last of his rations at breakfast. The team's water situation was becoming critical, and their pace was far too slow to reach the extraction point on schedule. That's when they heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. "Tracking team," Bryce whispered, suddenly looking less confident about his leadership abilities. The helicopters circled their area for several minutes before moving on, but the close call had rattled everyone's nerves. As they huddled in inadequate concealment beneath a cluster of pine trees, Sarah could see that her teammates were beginning to realize the serious nature of their situation. "We need to pick up the pace," Bryce announced, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Maybe we should reconsider our route," suggested one of the quieter team members. "This trail makes us too easy to track." "The route stays the same," Bryce insisted, but Sarah could see doubt creeping into his expression. As they resumed their march, the weather began to deteriorate. Dark clouds gathered overhead, and by late afternoon, a steady rain had begun to fall. The trail became muddy and treacherous, slowing their progress even further. When they finally stopped to make camp for the night, the team was exhausted, hungry, and thoroughly demoralized. Sarah had remained silent throughout the day's disasters, but as she watched her teammates struggling to set up wet shelters with inadequate gear, she began to worry about more than just the success of their mission. Trevor's boots had given him severe blisters that were now infected and swelling. Jake was showing early signs of dehydration despite their proximity to water sources. The combination of poor planning, inadequate skills, and deteriorating weather was creating a genuinely dangerous situation. As the temperature dropped and the rain intensified, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't stand by and watch her teammates suffer from problems she could easily solve, regardless of how badly they had treated her. "Bryce," she said quietly, approaching him as he struggled with his malfunctioning camp stove, "I think we need to talk." "About what?" he snapped, his frustration evident. "About getting everyone through this exercise safely. Trevor needs medical attention for his feet. Jake needs to rehydrate properly. And we're all going to be in serious trouble if we spend the night in wet clothes with no way to dry them. And I suppose you have all the answers." Bryce's tone was sarcastic, but Sarah could hear the underlying concern in his voice. "I have some suggestions," she said carefully, "but I need you to trust me enough to listen." For the first time since the exercise began, Bryce actually looked at her as a potential asset rather than a burden. The reality of their situation was finally sinking in, and his pride was beginning to take a back seat to the welfare of his team. "What kind of suggestions?" he asked grudgingly. Sarah glanced around at their inadequate campsite and her struggling teammates. What she was about to propose would reveal skills that she had kept carefully hidden throughout her time at the academy. But as she watched Trevor wince with each step and saw Jake's hands shaking from exhaustion and dehydration, she knew that keeping her secrets was less important than keeping her team alive. "First," she said, "we need to move to higher ground and better shelter. This valley is going to flood if the rain continues, and we're too exposed to thermal imaging from aircraft. Second, Trevor needs proper treatment for his feet before infection sets in. Third, we need to establish a reliable water source and get a proper fire going so everyone could dry their gear. And you know how to do all of this?" Bryce asked, his skepticism warring with desperate hope. Sarah nodded. "My father taught me a few things about wilderness survival." What she didn't mention was that those few things represented 15 years of intensive training from one of the world's most elite special operations soldiers. As she prepared to reveal her true capabilities to her teammates, Sarah had no idea that she was about to transform not just their chances of survival, but their entire understanding of who she really was. The girl they had dismissed as an outsider was about to demonstrate skills that would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, competence, and what it truly meant to be a warrior. The transformation began slowly, then accelerated as Sarah's teammates realized they were watching someone operate on an entirely different level than anything they had experienced before. Within 30 minutes of Bryce grudgingly agreeing to let her take the lead, Sarah had identified a defensible position on higher ground that provided natural wind protection and multiple escape routes. She had located 3 separate water sources, including a small spring that would provide clean water without the need for purification tablets. Most impressively, she had assessed the medical condition of each team member and begun treating Trevor's infected blisters with supplies improvised from their standard field kits. "How did you know about that spring?" Jake asked as Sarah led them to a hidden water source that wasn't marked on any of their maps. "Water always seeks the lowest point," Sarah explained matter-of-factly. "But underground streams sometimes surface at elevation changes. You can usually spot them by looking for specific types of vegetation and listening for subtle sound patterns." She was carefully not mentioning that her father had taught her to locate water sources during their weekend camping trips by using techniques developed for survival behind enemy lines. Every skill she was demonstrating had been learned through years of training that would have challenged seasoned military professionals. As the evening progressed, Sarah's quiet competence began to reshape the entire dynamic of their team. She showed Trevor how to properly treat and wrap his blisters using medical tape and padding from their first aid supplies. She taught Jake a hydration strategy that would help his body recover from mild dehydration without making him sick. Most remarkably, she constructed a fire that burned hot and clean despite the persistent rain, using techniques that seemed to defy the basic laws of physics. "This is impossible," Trevor muttered as he watched Sarah's fire continue burning steadily while rain fell directly on it. "Fire can't burn in this weather. It's all about fuel selection and air circulation," Sarah explained. "Wetwood won't burn, but there's always dry fuel if you know where to look. Dead branches that are still attached to trees stay dry longer than fallen wood. Pine needles and birch bark contain natural oils that burn even when damp. And if you build your fire structure to create proper updraft, the heat will evaporate moisture faster than the rain can penetrate." What she didn't explain was that her father had made her practice fire building in every conceivable weather condition, including during simulated emergency scenarios where failure to create heat could mean the difference between life and death. By the third day, the entire team dynamic had shifted. Bryce still maintained his official leadership role, but everyone was looking to Sarah for practical guidance. Her route planning had allowed them to cover twice the distance of the previous day while leaving minimal tracking evidence. Her resource management had solved their food and water shortages. Her tactical awareness had helped them avoid 2 separate encounters with tracking teams that would have ended their exercise and capture. "Sarah," Bryce said during a rest break, his tone completely different from the condescending hostility of previous weeks. "Where exactly did you learn all this stuff?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. She had promised her father that she would never reveal the specifics of his service record, but her teammates deserved to understand why she possessed capabilities that exceeded their training. "My father served in the Navy," she said finally. "He spent a lot of time training for worst-case scenarios. He taught me that survival isn't about having the best equipment or the most resources. It's about making the best use of whatever you have available." "Yeah, but this goes way beyond basic survival training," Jake pressed. "The way you read terrain, the way you move through the woods without making sound, the way you can spot potential threats before the rest of us even know they're there. This is like professional-level stuff." Sarah felt a moment of pride at the recognition, but also a growing concern about how much she was revealing. Her father had always warned her that exceptional skills would draw attention, and attention could create complications. "He was very thorough," she said simply. What her teammates were witnessing was the result of a childhood spent learning from Mike Mitchell's patient instruction. Every weekend camping trip had been a lesson in tactical movement, situational awareness, and survival psychology. Every family hike had included training in observation skills, threat assessment, and evasion techniques. What Sarah's father had taught her wasn't just camping knowledge. It was a comprehensive education in special operations methodology, adapted for civilian life, but retaining all of its lethal effectiveness. The fourth day brought their first serious test of trust. The tracking teams had intensified their search, and Sarah's enhanced awareness had detected signs of an impending sweep that would cover their planned route. She knew of an alternative path that would keep them ahead of the pursuit, but it would require taking risks that went against standard academy protocols. "We need to cross the ridge line," she told Bryce during an emergency planning session. "The tracking teams are setting up a containment operation in the valley. If we stick to the standard route, we'll walk directly into their trap." "Crossing the ridge line is against regulations," Bryce protested. "That area is off-limits for safety reasons." "The safety restrictions are for normal weather conditions," Sarah countered. "The real danger right now is getting captured because we followed regulations instead of adapting to changing circumstances." The debate revealed a fundamental difference in military philosophy. Bryce had been trained to follow established procedures and trust in the system. Sarah had been taught to think independently and prioritize mission success over bureaucratic compliance. "What makes you so confident about this?" Trevor asked. "How do you know the tracking teams are setting up an operation?" Sarah hesitated. Explaining her reasoning would require revealing observational skills that most people would find difficult to believe. She had detected the tracking operation by noticing subtle changes in aircraft flight patterns, interpreting radio traffic that others dismissed as background noise, and reading terrain features that indicated likely positions for surveillance teams. "I've been watching their patterns for 3 days," she said finally. "They're herding us toward a specific area where they can control the terrain. If we go where they expect us to go, we'll be captured. If we take the ridge route, we can stay ahead of them and reach the extraction point on schedule. The decision came down to trust. After 3 days of watching Sarah's predictions prove accurate and her solutions work perfectly, the team was beginning to believe that she might know things that their textbooks didn't teach. "All right," Bryce said reluctantly. "We'll try your route. But if this goes wrong, it's on you." Sarah nodded, accepting the responsibility. What she didn't tell them was that she had already identified 3 contingency plans in case their primary route failed, along with emergency extraction points that could get them to safety even if everything went completely wrong. The ridge crossing turned out to be a masterpiece of tactical movement. Sarah led them along paths that seemed to exist only in her imagination, finding routes through terrain that their maps suggested was impassable. She guided them past sensor positions that they never even saw, timing their movement to avoid detection by aircraft that appeared and disappeared with clockwork precision. When they finally reached the far side of the ridge and looked back at the valley below, they could see the tracking teams moving through the exact areas where they would have been if they had followed standard procedures. The containment operation was real, it was comprehensive, and it would have ended their exercise in complete failure. "How did you know?" Jake asked in amazement. "My father always said that the enemy's greatest advantage is predictability," Sarah replied. "If you do what they expect you to do, you make their job easy. But if you think independently and stay flexible, you can turn their expectations against them." As they settled into their final campsite before reaching the extraction point, Sarah's teammates looked at her with a mixture of respect and confusion that she had never seen before. They were beginning to understand that they had spent weeks harassing someone who possessed skills that exceeded their own by a considerable margin. But they still had no idea who her father really was, or how dramatically their perception of Sarah Mitchell was about to change when they finally learned the truth about the quiet man who drove the old Honda and had taught his daughter everything she knew about being a warrior. The extraction point was supposed to be a routine pickup at dawn on the 5th day, but nothing about this exercise had gone according to the original plan. As Sarah's team approached the designated clearing, she immediately sensed that something was wrong. "Wait," she whispered, holding up her hand to stop the group's advance. For the past 4 days, her teammates had learned to trust her instincts without question. They froze in place, watching as Sarah moved forward alone to scout the pickup zone. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. The clearing was empty. There were no Academy vehicles, no extraction team, no signs of the organized pickup that should have been waiting for them. More disturbing, Sarah could see evidence of recent activity that suggested their exercise had taken an unexpected turn. She returned to the team with grim news. "The extraction team isn't here. Based on the tire tracks and equipment marks, I'd say they were here yesterday, but left in a hurry." "What does that mean?" Bryce asked, his voice tight with concern. "It means we're not dealing with a standard training exercise anymore," Sarah replied. "Something has happened that changed the parameters of our mission." As if summoned by her words, the sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the forest. But this wasn't the familiar rhythm of the Academy's training aircraft. This was something heavier, more purposeful, and it was heading directly toward their position. "Everyone down," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made even Bryce obey without question. They took cover beneath the tree canopy as a military helicopter passed overhead, flying a search pattern that was far more systematic than anything they had encountered during the training exercise. Through the branches, Sarah caught a glimpse of the aircraft and felt her blood run cold. It wasn't an Academy helicopter. It was a Black Hawk with military markings that she recognized from her father's photo albums. This was a real military operation, which meant their training exercise had somehow become entangled with an actual emergency situation. "Sarah," Trevor whispered urgently, "what exactly is happening here?" Before she could answer, Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up the sound of voices approaching through the forest. Multiple voices, moving with professional discipline and coordination that was far beyond anything the Academy's tracking teams could manage. These weren't instructors playing war games with students. These were real soldiers conducting a real operation. "We need to move," Sarah said quietly. "Right now." "Move where?" Jake demanded. "We're supposed to wait here for extraction." "The extraction isn't coming," Sarah explained patiently. At least not the way we planned. We're in the middle of something bigger than our training exercise, and we need to get clear of this area before we become a complication for whoever is running the real operation. Her teammates stared at her with expressions that mixed confusion with growing alarm. The comfortable world of structured training exercises was dissolving around them, replaced by a reality that was far more complex and dangerous than anything they had prepared for. "How do you know all this?" Bryce asked. "How can you tell the difference between our exercise and whatever else is happening?" Sarah looked at her teammates and realized that she had reached the limit of what she could accomplish without revealing more about her background. The skills her father had taught her were designed for exactly this type of situation, but using them effectively would require her to step completely outside her role as a fellow cadet. "Because my father didn't just serve in the Navy," she said finally. "He was part of a special operations unit that specialized in exactly these kinds of scenarios. Everything he taught me about survival and tactics was based on real-world experience in situations where making the wrong decision could get people killed." The silence that followed her admission was broken by the sound of radio chatter from the approaching voices. Sarah's teammates couldn't understand the tactical communications, but Sarah recognized immediately that they were listening to a manhunt. Someone dangerous was loose in the forest, and the military was conducting a serious operation to track them down. "We're leaving," Sarah announced. "Now." She led them away from the clearing using movement techniques that seemed to make them invisible to the searchers. While her teammates stumbled through the undergrowth making what seemed like enormous amounts of noise, Sarah moved like a shadow, somehow finding paths through terrain that left no tracks and produced no sound. 20 minutes later, they had covered nearly 2 miles without being detected by the search teams that were now swarming through the area they had just vacated. Sarah brought them to rest in a natural cave formation that provided complete concealment and multiple escape routes. "All right," Bryce said once they had caught their breath. "I think it's time you told us exactly who your father is." Sarah considered her options. Her father had sworn her to secrecy about the specifics of his service, but their current situation had moved far beyond normal circumstances. Her teammates deserved to understand why she was capable of keeping them safe in a scenario that was clearly beyond their training. "His name is Mike Mitchell," she began slowly. "He served 15 years in the Navy, with the last 10 years in naval special warfare. He was part of SEAL Team 6. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Jake's mouth fell open. Trevor sat down hard, as if his legs had stopped working. Even Bryce, who prided himself on never showing surprise, stared at her with undisguised amazement. "SEAL Team 6, Jake whispered. "Your father was part of SEAL Team 6? "He was," Sarah confirmed. "He served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places he still can't talk about. Everything I've shown you over the past 4 days, I learned from him. Every technique, every tactical principle, every survival skill. He's been training me since I was old enough to walk." "But why didn't you ever tell us?" Trevor asked. "Why did you let us think?" "Think what?" Sarah interrupted. "That he was just some guy who pushed papers? That I didn't belong at the academy because my family didn't have the right military connections?" Her voice carried a note of steel that none of them had heard before. "My father taught me that respect is earned through actions, not inherited through bloodlines. I wanted to prove myself based on what I could do, not who my father was." Bryce shook his head slowly. "We were idiots. Complete idiots." "Yes," Sarah agreed simply. "You were." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of helicopters returning, this time flying in a coordinated pattern that indicated the search was intensifying. Sarah moved to the cave entrance and observed the aircraft through a gap in the rock formation. "They're expanding the search perimeter," she reported. "Whatever they're looking for, they haven't found it yet." "What do you think is happening?" Trevor asked. Sarah considered the evidence. Military helicopters, professional search teams, expanded perimeters, radio traffic that indicated a high-priority manhunt. The pieces formed a picture that she had hoped never to encounter outside of her father's stories. "Someone has escaped from military custody," she said finally. "Probably someone with special operations training who knows how to evade conventional search techniques. The military is trying to recapture them before they can reach populated areas or make contact with outside support." How dangerous are we talking about? Jake asked nervously. Sarah looked at her teammates and realized that their training exercise had become something far more serious than any of them had bargained for. They were in the middle of a real military operation, possibly involving a genuine threat to national security. Dangerous enough that I need to get you all out of here safely, she said. And dangerous enough that we're going to do exactly what my father taught me to do in situations like this. Which is what? Bryce asked. Sarah smiled grimly. We're going to disappear completely until the professionals finish their job. And then we're going to find our own way home. As she began planning their evasion route, Sarah reflected on the irony of the situation. For weeks, her teammates had treated her like an outsider who didn't belong in their military world. Now she was the only thing standing between them and a situation that could easily get them all killed. The daughter of the quiet man with the old Honda was about to demonstrate exactly what 15 years of training by one of America's most elite warriors could accomplish when the stakes were real and failure was not an option. The escape from the search zone required every skill that Mike Mitchell had ever taught his daughter, and several that Sarah had to improvise on the spot. For 6 hours, she led her teammates through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, using techniques that kept them completely invisible to the helicopters, ground teams, and electronic surveillance equipment that was saturating the forest. They moved in single file, stepping exactly where Sarah stepped, stopping when she stopped, freezing like statues when aircraft passed overhead. She guided them through stream beds to mask their tracks, along rocky ridgelines that left no footprints, and through dense vegetation that concealed them from thermal imaging systems. By late afternoon, they had traveled 12 miles without being detected, reaching a position far outside the active search perimeter. Only then did Sarah allow them to rest and attempt to make contact with the academy. The radio call revealed the full scope of what they had stumbled into. A former special operations soldier named Marcus Kane had escaped from a military transport while being transferred to a maximum security prison. Kane had been convicted of selling classified information to foreign agents, and his escape had triggered a massive manhunt involving multiple agencies and military units. All cadet training exercises have been suspended indefinitely, the Academy Communications officer informed them. Extraction teams will be dispatched to your location once the security situation is resolved. Maintain your current position and avoid any contact with unknown individuals. After ending the radio call, Sarah's teammates sat in stunned silence as the reality of their situation fully sank in. They had spent 4 days learning from someone whose father had trained her to operate in exactly these kinds of scenarios, and she had just successfully guided them through a genuine military crisis without any of them even realizing how much danger they had been in. Sarah, Bryce said finally, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you about 1,000 apologies. We all do, Jake added. We were completely wrong about everything. Sarah looked at her teammates and felt a complex mixture of emotions. The vindication was satisfying, but it came at a cost. She had revealed secrets about her family that she had hoped to keep private. More importantly, she had been forced to step outside the role of a normal cadet and demonstrate capabilities that would change how everyone at the academy viewed her. The apologies are appreciated, she said. But what matters now is what happens when we get back to school. What do you mean? Trevor asked. I mean that everything changes now. You know who my father is. You know what I'm capable of. Word is going to spread through the academy, and people are going to treat me differently. Some will be impressed, some will be intimidated, and some will resent me even more than before. Bryce nodded slowly. You're probably right, but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Maybe it's time for people to understand that military excellence comes in different forms. As evening approached, they received word that Marcus Kane had been recaptured attempting to cross the state border. The immediate danger was over, and extraction helicopters would arrive at their position in the morning. They spent their final night in the wilderness discussing what they had learned and how it would change their relationships going forward. Can I ask you something? Jake said as they sat around Sarah's expertly constructed fire. Why didn't your father want you to tell people about his service record? Sarah considered the question. It touched on principles that had shaped her entire upbringing and her father's worldview about service and humility. He believes that true professionals don't advertise their capabilities, she explained. The most dangerous people are often the ones you never suspect. He taught me that real strength comes from being underestimated, because it gives you advantages that arrogance and reputation can't provide. But doesn't that put you at a disadvantage in an environment like the academy? Trevor asked, where reputation and family connections matter so much. Maybe, Sarah admitted. But it also taught me to rely on my own abilities instead of expecting respect I hadn't earned. Every challenge I faced, I had to overcome through my own effort. Every skill I developed, I had to master through practice and determination. That made me stronger than I would have been if I had started with everyone's respect and admiration. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching their position. But this time, Sarah recognized the familiar rhythm of Academy aircraft coming to bring them home. As they prepared for extraction, Bryce pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "I want you to know that this changes everything for me," he said seriously. "Not just because of who your father is, but because of who you are. You could have let us fail. You could have watched us stumble through that exercise and proved your point about our arrogance and incompetence. Instead, you saved us. You put our safety ahead of your own pride, even after how badly we treated you." Sarah nodded. "That's what you do for your team, even when your team doesn't deserve it." "I hope I can learn to be that kind of leader," Bryce said. "You can," Sarah replied. "But it starts with understanding that leadership isn't about being the most important person in the room. It's about making sure everyone else can succeed." The extraction went smoothly, and by noon the following day, they were back at the academy. Word of their adventures spread quickly through the cadet corps, but not in the way Sarah had feared. Instead of creating resentment or intimidation, her actions during the crisis had earned genuine respect from cadets who understood the difference between inherited privilege and earned competence. The harassment stopped completely, not because Sarah had revealed her father's identity, but because she had demonstrated through her actions that she belonged at the academy as much as anyone else. Her tormentors had learned that underestimating someone based on appearances or assumptions was a mistake that could have serious consequences. More importantly, the experience had changed how Sarah saw herself. She no longer felt like an outsider trying to prove she belonged. She had proven it beyond any doubt, not through her father's reputation, but through her own skills and character. 6 months later, Sarah graduated at the top of her class and received a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. At the graduation ceremony, Mike Mitchell sat in the audience wearing his only suit, the same humble demeanor that had once caused people to underestimate both him and his daughter. But now, as Sarah crossed the stage to receive her diploma, everyone in that auditorium knew exactly what the quiet man in the old Honda had accomplished. They knew that he had raised a daughter who embodied the finest traditions of military service, combining technical competence with moral courage and the kind of quiet leadership that inspired others to be their best selves. After the ceremony, as families gathered for photographs and celebrations, Bryce Thornton approached Mike Mitchell with an expression of deep respect. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for raising someone who made all of us better soldiers and better people." Mike smiled and shook Bryce's hand. "She did that herself. I just gave her the tools. What she accomplished with them was entirely her own choice." As Sarah watched her father interact with her former tormentors, now turned respectful colleagues, she reflected on the lessons that had shaped her entire journey. True strength came from character, not reputation. Real leadership emerged from service to others, not from demanding recognition. And the most important battles were often won not through conflict, but through the patient demonstration of principles that inspired others to rise to their own highest potential. The quiet girl who had arrived at Riverside Military Academy in her father's old Honda had become a leader who would carry forward the finest traditions of American military service. And she had done it not by revealing who her father was, but by showing who she had chosen to become. The cadets who had once asked, "Do you know my dad?" had learned something far more valuable. They had learned to ask themselves a different question: Do I know who I am? And am I worthy of the trust others place in me? For Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a Navy SEAL and proud graduate of Riverside Military Academy, the answer to that question would guide her through a career dedicated to serving something greater than herself. And every challenge she would face in the years ahead, she would meet with the quiet confidence of someone who had already proven that true warriors are made not by their bloodline, but by their choices.